Welcome to another deep dive. We always appreciate you sending us your sources. That's what makes the show work.
Yeah.
And we try to extract the key insights, giving you a shortcut to being seriously well-informed.
Yeah.
Today it's all about Geoff Thompson's Art of Fighting Without Fighting, specifically his book, Martial Arts Self-Defense. The title gives us a pretty good clue, but we're digging deeper into how to avoid physical threats altogether.
Yeah, that's right. Forget the fancy footwork. I mean, at least for now. Our mission is to break down Thompson's core idea that violence isn't the answer.
Right.
And then we're going to look at the strategies that he gives you so that you don't have to throw a punch, for your safety.
Yeah, right. And Geoff Thompson isn't just some guy talking about stuff he read in a book somewhere.
Right.
This is someone with real-world experience. He's got over 20 books out there.
Wow.
And he's really known for books like Watch My Back, Bouncer,
Yeah.
and On the Door. And these are all autobiographical. He worked as the nightclub doorman for 9 years.
Wow.
So he's seen some stuff.
Oh, yeah. 9 years as a doorman. You've got to see a lot of stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the sheer volume of experience. This guy's a serious martial artist.
Yeah.
5th Dan black belt in Japanese karate, 1st Dan in judo,
Wow.
and a senior instructor level and a bunch of other grappling arts and stuff.
Yeah.
So,
He knows what he's talking about.
absolutely.
Yeah.
He's also been featured in, GQ, FHM, Maxim, Arena, Front, Loaded, all these magazines.
Mm-hmm.
He's been on TV. Currently, he's a contributing editor for Men's Fitness
Mm-hmm.
and a self-defense columnist for Front Magazine. He's also got books like The Pavement Arena and Fear the Friend of Exceptional People,
Okay.
really, really cementing him as a serious guy in this subject.
Absolutely. He's
Yeah.
got the experience to back up what he's saying.
Yeah. Here's a guy who's clearly mastered the physical side of conflict.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes the idea of this book even more compelling. He's been in over 300 street fights by his own count.
300 street fights.
And he used, physical responses.
Yeah.
But now he's writing a book about how to avoid fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So what sparked this kind of fundamental change in his thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a thing that really intrigued me.
Right.
How do you go from all of that experience of the 300 street fights to saying, no, I want to find a way to not have to do that? And Thompson explains that while a physical response, might seem like the solution in the moment, it almost always creates worse problems and longer lasting problems as well.
Right.
That's the hard-won lesson,
Yeah.
from the 300 fights.
All right, so let's unpack that.
Okay.
And Thompson really kicks this off with a pretty powerful story
Mhm.
about this really well-renowned Aikido master on a train.
Yeah. Mhm.
What happened?
Okay, so this Aikido master,
Yeah.
he dedicated his whole life to Aikido, but he never had to use it in a real fight.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's like purely theoretical at this point.
Yeah. Well, and he even longed to have that moment to test his skills. He'd never been in a situation.
Yeah.
And he was on a commuter train, and a really drunk guy got on the train and was being really aggressive and harassing the passengers,
Uh-oh.
Yeah. And the Aikido master was like, okay, this is it.
This is my moment.
Yeah,
Right.
This is it. This is the time I've been waiting for. I can finally put all this training into practice. And he's about to get up and intervene.
Yeah.
But before the drunk guy even got to him, another passenger got up and went over to the drunk guy. And he started talking to him in a really friendly manner, just said, hey, why don't you sit down? It looks like you're having a bad day.
Right.
And the drunk guy, really taken aback by this kindness,
Yeah.
opened up
Wow.
and was talking to this guy. And within minutes, he was actually crying,
Wow.
pouring out his emotions.
Wow.
And the Aikido master witnessed this.
Yeah.
And he was just in awe. And he said, that's Aikido.
Wow.
That's it.
So no high kicks, no throws.
None of that. None of the physical stuff. It's all about de-escalating the situation. The passenger de-escalated the situation through dialogue,
Right.
through empathy, and demonstrated a higher level of martial art. That of preventing the fight from ever happening.
Yeah.
So this isn't about pacifism.
Right.
It's about the true mastery lies in preventing the conflict, which
Yeah.
a lot of traditional martial arts, they don't really teach that.
Yeah, it's all about the physical engagement.
Exactly. Yeah. So that story, it really sets the tone for the entire book.
Yeah.
In that the ultimate victory is one where no violence occurs.
Right. Now, you mentioned Thompson's own evolution.
Right.
He went from being in hundreds of street fights
Mm-hmm.
to now he's an advocate for avoiding them. How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, he went through a pretty profound transformation, but it was gradual. It's like anything, it takes time. And he openly admits that in his early years, especially during that time, he was a doorman.
Yeah.
He didn't just justify violence, but he also used verbal intimidation to reinforce his authority.
Right.
And he calls his old views Neanderthal,
Wow.
which is pretty self-aware, I think.
Yeah.
He's pretty honest with himself and his reflection there. And he said it was driven by, just a very basic understanding of conflict.
Yeah. Right.
And he genuinely believed in those views at the time. But as his life experiences broadened and he learned more, he gained a new perspective.
Right.
He recognized that violence is futile and the lasting pain that it caused on all the people involved, himself included.
Right.
So he actually now views physical conflict as a microcosm of war.
Oh,
It leads to destruction.
Yeah.
So his mission now is to promote nonviolent alternatives. And he believes it's absolutely essential for the survival of the species.
Wow.
For peaceful coexistence.
So we've got the Aikido master story, which kind of paints that picture of the ideal.
Yeah.
But for someone like Thompson, who has this history of physical confrontations, it's not going to be a huge shift in perspective.
Absolutely. It is, yeah.
Okay. So this turning point, his philosophy now is about avoiding violence.
Mm-hmm.
But he also acknowledges that, sometimes that's just not possible.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
There are situations where fighting without fighting, you just can't do that.
That's right. Yeah. Thompson understands that there are extreme circumstances where a physical response is unavoidable. Self-preservation, protecting your family.
Right.
In those situations, you might have to use force. He even talks about a conversation he had with Benny at the Jet. Urquidez, the kickboxer.
Yeah.
And Urquidez said, if someone forces you to use violence on them, it's their karma. It's the consequence of their actions.
Right. So is that justification for the violence?
In a way, yeah. It's like it's their fault.
Yeah.
They brought it upon themselves.
Yeah.
But Thompson struggles with that contradiction.
Right. Because it's still violence.
It is. And he says, while violence is wrong, it can sometimes be a necessary evil, a temporary antidote in a world where, humanity's still evolving towards more peaceful interactions.
And that's where his concept of the select few comes in. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So he compares it to like the killer T cells in the body.
Okay.
In society, there's this small segment of people who may need to employ violence to safeguard the rest of the community from those who would inflict harm.
So like the police or the military?
Those kinds of guys, yeah. But he's careful to say this doesn't make violence right. It's not a good thing, but it's necessary until humanity reaches a higher level, a more spiritual domain.
Right, and that's kind of a controversial idea, I thought.
Yeah, it is. Relying on that kind of killer T-cell analogy to justify violence.
Yeah. It's like, are you saying these people are better than everybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little bit tricky, yeah.
Yeah. But the main thrust of the book, as the title suggests, is how to avoid ever reaching that point.
Exactly.
Right. The whole point is to give you listening a bunch of strategies to avoid physical altercations altogether.
Yeah.
So that force is a last resort.
Absolutely.
Right. Truly desperate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And Thompson's core belief is that if you have more options, you have more than just a punch on the nose.
Yeah.
Then you can evade danger strategically and achieve a victory without ever having to engage physically.
Yeah. And the cornerstone of his philosophy, the first line of defense, is avoidance.
Right.
Chapter 1 is called Being Not There.
Okay.
Which seems straightforward, but I'm sure there's more to it than just walking away.
Yeah. He says it sounds simple, but it's actually a skill that's often underestimated.
Okay.
True avoidance requires, awareness of your surroundings, understanding the potential enemy and their tactics, and understanding yourself, your own ego, pride, your triggers, and a really good understanding of the environment you're in. And even if you have martial arts training, you have to look at it critically.
Yeah.
Is this really going to help me in a real world situation?
Right. Because it might not.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And he really talks about confidence being a big part of avoidance.
Yeah.
How are those two things connected?
Well, he says that genuine self-confidence, the belief in your abilities and worth, that eliminates the need to prove yourself.
Yeah.
Through confrontation.
Right.
If you're secure in who you are, you don't need to get in a fight to validate yourself.
Right.
And that allows you to walk away
Yeah.
without feeling like you've lost or backed down.
Right.
But it's often the insecure people or the people with the really big egos.
Yeah.
And he calls out martial artists here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They're so concerned with their image
Right.
and looking good.
Yeah.
So it's them that end up getting sucked into these conflicts that could have been avoided.
Right.
You know?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now, he also talks about target hardening
Okay.
in personal safety. What's that about?
Yeah. So it's about making yourself less attractive to attackers.
Okay.
And he gets this from interviews he did with burglars.
Oh, wow.
They always target places that look vulnerable and unprotected, and they avoid the ones with visible security.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this same principle applies to personal safety.
Yeah.
Being aware of your surroundings, understanding potential threats, and projecting an aura of, alertness and confidence. You basically make yourself a harder target,
Right.
less likely to be chosen as a victim.
Yeah. Like you're not an easy mark.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Thompson also talks about the modern enemy
Mm-hmm.
and how their tactics have changed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the direct physical assault anymore.
No.
There's a psychological element to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He says street confrontations today, they're not like, a formal match.
Right.
They're not like the UFC. It's more likely to be a 3-second fight.
2-second fight.
Yeah.
Okay.
A really sudden attack.
Yeah.
And it's often preceded by a conversation,
Okay.
which could seem innocent or it could be really aggressive.
Right.
And the purpose of that leading technique is to distract you,
Yeah.
create an opening, and then they can hit you.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a script.
Yeah. It is.
That's kind of chilling,
It is.
but a valuable insight.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he breaks it down into what he calls the 4 Ds.
The 4 Ds. Okay. What are those?
Dialogue, deception, distraction, and submissive distraction.
Okay. So break those down for me a little bit.
All right. So the first one, dialogue. That's just the initial engagement.
Right.
You know how the attacker starts talking to you?
Yeah.
And then deception, that's the spoken word and their demeanor.
Right.
They use it to trick you, to make you feel safe
Yeah.
and misjudge the situation. And Thompson actually gives a really blunt piece of advice here.
Yeah.
He says, if his lips move, he's lying.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
And then he also talks about the protective fence,
Right.
which we'll come to later.
Mhm.
But the third D, distraction.
Yeah.
So that's to engage your cognitive process, so you're thinking about what they're saying instead of what they might be about to do.
Right.
And this is done through questions
Yeah.
or seemingly irrelevant statements.
Okay.
He even gives an example of a doorman that he knew named Rob who'd say, I don't want to fight,
Oh.
right before he hit you.
So it's like the opposite of what they're actually thinking.
Yeah, exactly. It's just to distract you. And the final one, submissive distraction. That's when they use language like, I don't want any trouble,
Right.
I don't want to fight, but it lulls you into this state of complacency.
Right.
What he calls code white,
Right.
unaware.
So all this is really designed to exploit a victim's lack of preparedness,
Yeah.
especially people who, their self-defense training was all about physical reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of, self-defense training, unfortunately, it ignores this pre-contact stage.
Right. It's all about, okay, somebody throws a punch, you do this.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not realistic.
No, it's
So,
not.
recognizing these tactics, that's why Thompson emphasizes that code yellow.
Yes.
Awareness.
Right.
You've got
Yeah.
to be ready. You've got to be aware of that conversation.
Yeah.
That's leading up to the violence.
Yeah.
Not just waiting for the punch.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, what about how our body reacts in these situations?
Yeah.
Physiologically.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about this adrenal dump.
Yeah.
How does that impact our ability to react?
Okay, so when we see a threat,
Yeah.
we get a flood of adrenaline.
Yeah.
All those stress hormones. And that's the adrenal dump.
Right.
Now, that can be a good thing. It can make you stronger, faster, and you can tolerate more pain.
Yeah.
But most people don't experience that very often. And so when they do, they think it's fear.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They misinterpret those physical sensations.
Right.
So they freeze up,
Wow.
So
it's not fear.
Well, it is, but it's caused by the adrenaline.
Right. It's not like, oh, I'm afraid to do this. It's like, oh, my body's doing this. And now my brain's like, oh, no, we're scared.
Exactly.
Huh.
Wow. So Thompson says you've got to understand fear.
Yeah.
If you can't recognize and manage those feelings, then you're going to struggle when there's a threat.
Yeah. So this isn't just about techniques. This is about your psychology as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Being able to handle that pressure.
Mm.
And this kind of ties into Geoff Cooper's color coding system for threat awareness.
Right.
Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Okay, so Geoff Cooper, he came up with this color code to categorize your level of awareness.
Okay.
So code white, that's like total non-awareness. You're switched off.
Right.
You know you're not paying attention.
So that's where you don't want to be.
No, you don't want to be there because that's when you're vulnerable.
Right.
And that's what the attackers are looking for. Code yellow, that's like relaxed alertness.
Okay.
So you're aware of your surroundings.
Yeah.
You're looking around, you're paying attention, you're seeing potential vulnerabilities,
Okay.
secluded doorways, things like that.
Right.
Techniques you haven't tested,
Hmm.
the adrenal dump, attacker rituals,
Okay.
you know? And he compares this to commentary driving.
Commentary driving.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you know when you're driving, you're looking around,
Yeah.
you're seeing things even if you're not consciously thinking about them.
Right. Right.
That's code yellow.
Okay.
Code orange is a heightened state of awareness.
Okay.
So that's when you see a potential threat. You know, maybe somebody suspicious looking is approaching you.
Right.
You're evaluating the situation. And then code red, that's when the threat is imminent.
Oh.
Or it's already happening.
Okay.
You've got to prepare to fight or run.
Right. And you said fight or run, but run's probably better.
Run is definitely better.
Okay.
Yeah. Get out of there.
So what's the key to making this system work?
The key is to always operate in code yellow.
Okay.
That's your baseline.
Right.
You can't respond to a threat if you don't know it's happening.
Right.
You know?
Can't be caught off guard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Thompson says, stay in orange or yellow and never drop to white.
Yeah.
You know, that's losing Zanshin, continuous awareness.
Right. So it's like mindful vigilance,
Exactly.
you know, but not paranoia.
Yeah.
There's a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Thompson gives some practical advice on how to use this to avoid trouble in the first place.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like being selective about where you go and managing your ego.
Exactly. Yeah. He says, avoid places where there's likely to be trouble, like really rowdy pubs.
Right.
Or late night places with, you know, undesirable people.
Okay.
If you have to be in those places, be extra vigilant.
Yeah.
You know, really pay attention.
Yeah.
As for ego, he says, don't let your pride get you into a fight.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Especially in situations like road rage.
Yeah. Road rage is a big one.
Yeah.
Or even just some little argument,
Yeah.
you know? It's not worth it.
Exactly. Yeah. He says there's no rush to the graveyard.
Right.
That's a piece of wisdom he got from his mother.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's true. It's so easy to get caught up in the moment and be like, you know.
Yeah. And then something terrible happened.
Yeah. He tells stories about his friends
Oh, really?
whose lives were ruined because of these ego-driven things.
Wow. Over like nothing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he's like, it's just not worth it. You know,
You're absolutely right.
you can get hurt, legal trouble, lose your freedom, impact on your family.
It's just not worth it
Yeah.
for some stupid argument. Exactly. And he says, you know, you've got to understand the other person.
Right.
Often the enemy, they don't even understand why they're angry,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and they might be taking it out on you. So it's not personal
Right.
unless you make it personal,
Right.
you know? So cultivate compassion,
Yeah.
let go of the little stuff.
Easier said than done, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. But you're right. The logic's there.
The logic is definitely there.
Yeah.
And he ends this chapter by saying, even if the person isn't angry at you specifically,
Right.
they can still be dangerous if you engage with them,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
And he says he can diffuse these situations because he's confident in his abilities.
Right.
He knows he could hurt them,
Right.
but he chooses not to.
Chooses the wiser path.
Exactly.
Okay. So avoidance is the goal.
Right.
But what if we find ourselves in a situation where we just can't avoid it?
Yeah.
That's where chapter 2 comes in. Escape.
Right. And he acknowledges that no matter how vigilant you are,
Yeah.
there are times when you just can't avoid it.
Right.
So escape is the next step.
Yeah.
To stay safe. And he points out there's this societal pressure
Yeah.
to stand your ground,
Right.
face your problems head on.
Right. Which is kind of the opposite of what he's saying.
Yeah. But he's also aware of the legal ramifications of defending yourself.
Yeah.
You know?
You can get in trouble even if you were defending yourself.
Yes, exactly. He calls it the second enemy,
Well,
the legal system.
Yeah.
So he's very aware of that.
Yeah.
And once again, ego comes into play
Yeah, of course.
as an obstacle to escape.
Because you don't want to look like a coward.
Exactly. You know?
Especially if you're a guy.
Yeah. But he says proper training, the kind that builds confidence, not aggression,
Right.
that will give you the strength to walk away.
Right.
He tells a story about a friend of his
Okay.
who was in a pub,
Yeah.
and this guy was staring at him.
Uh-oh.
And he asked for advice, and Thompson said, drink somewhere else.
Just go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he extends this principle to, like, if you're in a bar that seems like it's going to get bad,
Right.
leave. Even if you just bought a drink.
Right.
That little bit of money is nothing compared to, potentially getting hurt.
Yeah.
So what are some of the escape tactics he talks about?
Yeah. What are some of the specific things you can do?
Well, he says, swallow your pride. Just leave.
Yeah.
Even if it's with a group of people.
Right.
Your
friends.
Yeah.
Just go.
Yeah. Politely remove yourself. Maybe wave. But don't make eye contact.
Right.
If you bump into somebody, apologize and back away.
Yeah.
Say you don't want any trouble.
Right.
Now, if you absolutely can't avoid a fight,
Yeah.
he says any action you take should be preemptive
Okay.
and just focused on creating an escape route.
Okay.
He doesn't like the idea of, blocking and countering.
Right. Like
Yeah.
all that fancy stuff you see in movies.
Yeah. He's like, that doesn't work.
That's not realistic.
No.
Yeah.
He tells another story about being at a party.
Okay.
And this guy started confronting him,
Uh-oh.
accusing him of being a bodyguard,
Wow.
calling him a liar,
Yeah. Okay.
And Thompson could have easily beaten this guy up,
Right.
but he chose to stay calm,
Yeah.
just kept saying, I'm not a bodyguard,
Well,
and
yeah.
eventually just turned away to get his drinks.
Yeah.
Just completely disengaged.
Just diffuse the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he contrasts that with his friend Griff,
Okay.
who had the same encounter with the same guy.
Oh, no.
And Griff just hit him,
Oh, wow.
smashed his nose.
Wow.
So it shows you the difference in approach.
Yeah. Two different ways of handling the same situation.
Right.
Wow. Now, he talked about the attacker's ritual in the Avoidance chapter,
Mm-hmm.
which is also important for escape as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding why, where, and how the attacks happen.
Okay.
That can help you avoid the situation.
Yeah.
Or if you can't avoid it,
Yeah.
escape.
Right.
So he talks about the different types of attackers.
Okay.
You've got robbers, rapists, people who just want to hurt you,
Okay.
and their methods. And he says a lot of today's attackers, they're actually cowards.
Oh, really?
Yeah.